again, appreciate your joining. Hopefully this will be interesting and informative. So we are going to be recording this presentation. So if you have concerns about that, if you want to click off your camera or do whatever you do for privacy. So again, I'm Larry Crowther at Wegman Hessler. We're in Cleveland, Ohio. And Stuart is going to be my co-host.
Hi everyone. Hi, so I'm Stuart Scott Goldstone. I'm head of the corporate and commercial law team at Aaron&Partners, solicitors, lawyers in the UK. I'm going to be part of the panel today. A number of my colleagues and some other people with hopefully useful things to tell you about in terms of doing business in the UK.
Right, so we'll do a quick background on our firm. So again, Wegman Hessler, we're in Cleveland, Ohio, where we're today having the National Football Draft, the annual draft. It goes several days. Tonight's the kickoff, and it's pouring rain out here. So exactly what everybody hoped would not happen, but I think they'll get through it. So we have one office in Cleveland. We're a full service firm. We work primarily in the business area, and then the representation that's affiliated with that. We have about 25 lawyers. We actually added 2 lawyers this week, one business lawyer and an intellectual property lawyer. So we're glad that hopefully things are going to stabilize and people can move forward with plans. We represent companies in the business and corporate area, commercial litigation, domestic relations, family law, estate planning, and we have a very strong intellectual property group. Go ahead, Stuart.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I head up the corporate and commercial law team at Aaron&Partners. That's one of a number of teams that we have. We're full service law firm headquartered in Chester in the northwest of England. We also have offices in Shrewsbury, which is a area south of Chester, and also at in Manchester, near Manchester Airport and International Airport. We have around 95 lawyers working on a full range of the typical areas for a law firm to cover. That businesses, our principal clients are owner-managed businesses of all sizes, but we also assist with the personal legal needs of those business owners. So here we deal with wills, trust and probate, family and residential property issues alongside the usual business areas, some of which we'll hear about later today.
Very good. And then I just want to give a brief background about Iag Global. So it's a network of international lawyers and accountants in the major cities throughout the world. So we've been a member of Iag for about 10 years, and through that connection, I've gotten to know lawyers from the Aaron&Partners firm. And so interestingly enough, we've talked about doing this type of presentation for several years, and due to logistics, we never did it. So as bad as COVID is, we're all set up to jump on these video meetings. So it has its pros and cons. So if basically the group enables us, if a client needs a lawyer just about anywhere in the world, either we know the person directly or can quickly find a person that has a connection, so that you're not just picking a name off the internet. You've got a personal relationship with the lawyer that's assisting with the project. It's been a very positive experience for us. I think we have our first polling question. Okay, we'll give that a couple minutes. So we're coming up with our answer. Should we just jump ahead to the screen while it's tabulating? Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, why don't we go ahead to we'll circle back on that. Hey. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Sorry. All right, so we've got 50% no, but we've got 28% yes and 22% maybe. So that's 50-50. Well, hopefully after this discussion, some of the U.S. businesses will have more interest and comfort in proceeding into doing business and conducting business in the UK. So I think our next slide is just so people know where the cities are where both of these law firms are located. I think. Oh. Okay, here we go. Okay. So the US people know where Cleveland is, and just for the English UK folks that might be on the phone, you can see that we're fairly centrally located in the triangle that consists of New York City, Toronto, and Chicago. Being where we are, we're located to a large percentage of the total US population within a short drive, 8-hour drive. And so we have an industrial background similar to the Northern England. I'll let Stuart talk a little bit about Chester.
Yeah, so yeah, I can see the location where I in England. I've got the map of the whole of the Great Britain there. So I guess you obviously have Scotland at the top, and Wales to the left in the west, and London in the southeast. So very much at the heart of the country here, and also as in an area that has a history of manufacturing and heavy industry, but has since been moving into different industries to diversify, as we'll hear a bit more about from Joe, who is going to talk about the Warrington region has particular responsibility for promoting.
I do apologise. We're having some difficulties with these slides at the moment. We're getting on top of it as quickly as we can. We lost Julie for a moment, and she's just trying to reshare. Won't be a second.
Can Joe go ahead, and then we'll catch up with the slide.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, everyone. I'm Joe Manning. I'm the Chief Executive of Marketing Cheshire, and I'm also the Deputy Chief Executive at our local enterprise partnership, which is a public-private partnership focused on growth and investment in our region. I was just going to say a few words on the nature of the Cheshire and Warrington economy, but I think the first thing for everyone to know is that it's a real UK success story, and Cheshire and Warrington, although of course we're not competitive, but is the highest performing economy in the Northern Powerhouse. So across the north of England, Cheshire and Warrington is a real strong economy. Our current GVA is approximately £32.5 billion, and we have aspirations by 2040 to be growing that to approximately £50 billion. As Scott's already mentioned, we have a diversified economy with a number of sector strengths building on our industrial heritage. The slide here shows our ambitions around net zero and industrial decarbonisation. That's a real growth sector for us at the moment across both manufacturing and chemicals production. We also have a very strong life sciences industry, which has really come to the fore in the last year as well, particularly the manufacturing of complex medicines. And we're also very strong in advanced manufacturing with a number of significant global companies located in the region. I think the other thing for people to be aware of when considering Cheshire and Warrington is talent. We have a highly skilled workforce, but we also have access to a good labour market across the region. So 3 million people live within 30 minutes drive time of Cheshire and Warrington, and we also have 7 universities on our doorstep when you may be considering recruiting graduate talent. We are very well connected. So in terms of thinking about the local market, you've got Manchester, Liverpool, North Wales on the doorstep. You also have Birmingham and the Midlands, and London is only an hour and a half on the train from Crewe, or a few hours drive away. And then finally, I think the other important consideration is quality of life. Cheshire and Warrington has an incredibly strong quality of life offer, good housing, good schools, fantastic access to the natural environment, whether you enjoy short country walks and going down a kind of traditional British pub, or if you fancy getting a bit further afield and going into North Wales or the Peak District. So wonderful amenities on your doorstep. And then the final point on connectivity is obviously our international connectivity. You've got Manchester Airport for kind of global connectivity. You've also got access to ports, particularly the Port of Liverpool, which is very important when we're thinking about our logistics sector or our advanced manufacturing as well. So that's all I wanted to say. There's plenty more I could get into about Cheshire and Warrington, but perhaps I'll pick that up in questions.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I'm going to move on to just a summary of the topics we're going to cover today. Fine. We'll just move the slides on. Okay, so we're going to cover things to consider when entering or expanding business operations in the UK, legal differences between the two countries, tax implications of doing business here in the UK, what resources, incentives and advantages there are in setting up a business here, the human and cultural side of living in the UK, and general thoughts about trading here. I think next we're going to, Larry, I think we're going to cover who's on the panel today and let everyone, apart from myself and Larry, because we've already introduced ourselves, just give a brief summary about them and their role and their interests.
Right. Okay. So just a real quick going across the row here. Ikram Malik is a lawyer at Aaron&Partners, works in the immigration area, and also is going to give us some information on the US-UK treaties, such as there might be. David Mann is what we would call a litigator. I guess you're a barrister over there with Aaron&Partners. And Helen works in the employment law area. David Green is one of the business clients of Aaron&Partners who's agreed to join us. And Thomas Holm is a representative of one of our clients here at Wegman Hessler that we've been fortunate to work with over the years. Joe Manning, we've had a brief introduction with already. And Rob Whittle is one of the managing partner of Dyke Yaxley, which fits nicely with this program because they have offices in Northern England in accounting practice and tax practice, Northern England, and then as far as Cleveland, they have an office over on the east side of Cleveland in Beechwood. I've gotten to know Rob over the years and glad he's been able to join us. He's going to have some nice insight on the practical aspects of doing business in both countries. So with that, we'll start jumping into our questions here. What should U.S. companies consider when setting up or expanding a business in the UK? And why don't we just go, I guess, left to right, top to bottom?
Yeah, so I'll sort of say a little bit about the corporate aspects of that. The one thing you need to think about is how we're going to have our presence in the UK. Are we going to maybe set up our own company, a subsidiary of our US company in the UK, which is relatively easy to do? You can set up what's called a branch, which is something a bit simpler than that, where you have a permanent base here, but not necessarily actual legal presence. Or you can use what's called an LLP, a limited liability partnership, which is sometimes used where you want to make it easy to repatriate your profits back to the US. That's one way of doing it. You might acquire another business that's already here in the UK and use that as your means of getting into the UK. You have, obviously already a business that's got the skills and knowledge to operate in the UK when you acquire it, or have other commercial arrangements such as using an agent to sell your products, a distributor where you sell your products to them and they then sell them themselves in the UK, or use a franchise. broadly speaking, you know, those things work in a similar way to how they would in the US, although there are different regulations that cover, say, there are more regulations about the use of agents in the UK than perhaps there is in the US, but using franchises is perhaps subject to less regulation in the UK than it is compared to the US. There's some other topics that are of a more legal nature, which we'll cover later. David?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I thought about a couple of different things you might be able to say at this section, but I think the most important, certainly from my point of view, I think would be to say to people to consider very much the culture in the UK. The UK is a fabulous place to do business. If you come here, you can make money. That's a great reason to come. There's lots of similarities between the UK and the US, and that's fantastic. But there are, of course, differences as well. And it's those differences that lead sometimes to disputes between businesses. Which is where I come involved. And so in relation to culture, probably the best thing that anybody can do when coming over is making sure you've got the right professional advisors around you from the outset on a non-contentious point of view. So if you are doing business here, speak to Stuart, speak to Rob, who's going to follow me after this, speak to other professional advisors, because the consequence if you don't is you might end up having to speak to me. Now, it's okay, I'm a nice guy, it's fine, we will get on great, but you don't want to talk to me because by the time you get to me, you've got a problem. And so that's that. So cultural differences, I think, is the main thing to consider.
Hey, Rob?
Thanks, thanks, David. Ironically, I was going to mention cultural differences as well, but maybe a slightly different thing. So as Larry had mentioned, I spend a good portion of my time in the US and a good portion in the UK. So over the years, you've sort of picked up different things along the way. And cultural differences, although you think it's very similar, there's a lot of subtleties. And I suppose from a business perspective, the area where I see maybe the most cultural differences subtly is within the employment area and with your employees, and maybe what's important to an employee in the US office is not the same as what's important to your employee in the UK office, and how things are done and worked and stuff like that. So I would say if you're setting up in the UK, it certainly makes sense to actually spend a good amount of time in the UK on the ground, maybe in different areas, and really understand the culture and the subtle differences before you sort of commit and think the UK is the same as the US, as that sometimes happens.
Thanks, Rob. Joe?
I think for me, it is considering the location, but also that I think there's such opportunities in the UK outside some of the kind of well-known locations, obviously London, and then some of the city regions, which is obviously why we're here today to discuss opportunities in Cheshire and Warrington. And I think in doing that, it's also the scale of the UK, considerably smaller than the US, and your ability from a location such as Cheshire and Warrington to be able to access a large scale of markets across the country. So for me, that would be a kind of primary consideration, and taking your time to really understand the UK's geography and looking beyond perhaps some of those usual suspect locations.
Okay, Thomas?
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I've actually had the honor to work in Warrington and live in Cheshire and thoroughly enjoyed it. So if any US companies considering moving or setting up a business in UK, I'll say do it. I mean, there's great opportunities, there's a great climate, but I'll second what everybody else in the panel have said before, get the right advice. Link up with Aaron&Partners and companies like that, and make sure that you really have a good plan and the professional help to execute that. Understand the subtle differences in regards to culture. This is extremely important. There's a ton of similarities between UK and US, but there's also a ton of differences. So make sure you have the right setup, make sure you have the right plan, and execute accordingly with the right team around you and the right support and the right advisors around you. So, but don't be afraid. Europe, UK is not a difficult place to do business. It's actually relatively straightforward. There's rules, there's regulations, and they work. So go for it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for those comments. I think our next question is for Stuart as to, in addition to your earlier comments, what type of business law issues should a US company consider before entering into England, into the UK?
Yeah, I mean, this is just going to be a brief summary, and some of them we're going to expand on in a moment. But I've talked about what corporate structure you might want to use. There are tax issues to think about in terms of registering with the tax authorities, HMRC as it's called here in the UK, if you're operating here. Intellectual property, protecting your intellectual property. Again, we'll come on to that later. There are rules around data protection in the UK. They're different to the ones in the US. There'll be some similarities, but there'll be a lot of differences that you need to be aware of if your business is using personal data in particular. Any visas and immigration issues, again, we'll be covering those later. Employment law, the rules around employing people are different, as we'll hear in a moment. Various industries are particularly heavily regulated, and therefore will have their own rules that you need to bear in mind. Anything to do with health products, healthcare generally, financial services, rules on product liability, consumer law protections. There are certain particular rules that apply here to how you deal with customers if they're end consumers and not other businesses that are different here. If you're going to have a base here and have premises of some kind, there's various different ways of owning that property. You might own it outright, what's called freehold. You may have a lease of some kind, it might be a long-term, might be a short-term arrangement. You may have a serviced office or co-working space initially to minimize costs, all of which have pros and cons. I mentioned earlier, there are, in terms of if you're going to start off with having a commercial arrangement and use someone else to help you start your business in the UK, yeah, there are lots of issues about what arrangement you're going to use. How are you going to verify that person, your potential commercial partner, is up to the job and worthy? A number of, that's really just a brief summary, and as I say, we'll talk about some of those in more detail now.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Okay, so next we're going to get into a more substantive question on the employment law issues, and we have Helen and Thomas are going to join us. So I guess, Helen, if you could go first with kind of a high level, some general differences between the US and the UK with regard to employment law.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, I think, crucially at the moment in the UK, despite obviously the year we've had with COVID, we've got a fairly buoyant employment market. I think we're seeing lots of change. I'm sure Stuart would support this. There's lots of mergers, acquisitions. There's businesses really grasping the opportunity to streamline their businesses and make them more effective in the UK. I've got no doubt the same is going on in the US. But I do highlight that because it seems really exciting, really movable at the moment. In terms of doing work in the US or coming over to the UK, I suppose you've got to get back to contractual issues first of all and think about what is the governing jurisdiction for those contracts. If there's any issues arising, is that going to be challenged in the US or is it going to be challenged in the UK? Have you got workers coming over to the UK from the US, or are they based in the UK in the first place? Have you got a UK office? Or are you managing your employees in the UK from the US? So all of those issues, you may well need employment lawyers or labour lawyers from the US or from the UK to try to unpick some of that and decide on the best way forwards for you. In the UK, we have three sort of main status of employee: an employee itself, a worker, or you have self-employed status primarily. And with those different status comes different rights in employment law within the UK. So, for example, very briefly, an employer or a worker can bring a discrimination claim in the UK without a minimum working period with the employer. So from day one, they have that potential to bring that claim. Employees, when they've got full employment status with an employer, can bring unfair dismissal claims after a 2-year period. So we have these very clear employment laws and guidelines in the UK that you would need to be aware of if you were employing, or like I say, if you had workers or self-employed employees. So going back, I would say we need to look at the contractual arrangements, of course, first of all, the jurisdiction, and then primarily employment status. And then that would lead me on to immigration issues and the consideration of that, visas, and the impact of Brexit, which I know that Ikram will be picking up on. So those are some of the an overview of some of the employment points. Okay, so I have to ask a question here. So I've done couple transactions in England with acquisitions, and as part of the due diligence, we see in the employment area that there's a designated category for garden leave.
So,
yes, we love it, don't we? That expression. Yes, so garden leave is actually very, very regularly a term in contracts. And what that means is it's part of a notice period. It's not requiring that employee to actually work their notice within the workplace. It's actually preventing them from doing work within the workplace and potentially work from home. It really gives the employer some control over whether they're doing anything or nothing, and hence why it's termed garden leave. So during that notice period, that employee will be gardening, or they will be sunbathing, or they will be doing whatever, but obviously keeping out of the workplace and abiding by their contractual terms.
love that term. So, okay, Thomas, do you mind sharing some of your experiences with, I guess, being an employee and an employer in the UK, as from an American perspective? Or actually, you're Danish, so from
from a Danglish perspective, I guess. Yeah, but Helen have definitely made a good overview of that. But I think from me, or from the American side, from American perspective, as an American employer, you're not necessarily used to having the contract of employment to the same extent as you have in the UK and other places in Europe. So I think it's extremely important to get that right as a basis. There might be other things such as pensions and other insurances and stuff like that that comes above and beyond that as well that should be considered, which is not norm in US as well. If you go in and acquire a company, be aware that you might also have an obligation to transfer all, or at least the people that are mainly involved with that business as well. That might not be a regulation or a requirement that you have in other places of the world. So there's the two-pay rule that might need to be considered in that one. But for me, it's really finding that labor lawyer or that company that can help you in regards to the contracts around the employees that you either want to transfer from US and over, or the local UK or European employees that you want to hire.
Right. So I think just kind of in general, from an American's perspective, as far as the employees, that the process for reducing your workforce is more complicated and compliance issues in the UK than it is in the US. So it's something US companies need to be aware of before they, hire a bunch of people in an acquisition or start hiring people in a growth mode. It's, it can be managed, just have to be aware of it.
Right.
So Helen, any other thoughts on that?
Gosh, I don't think so. I mean, it's whether there's any questions or anything additional that I can add to there.
Okay, well, why don't we?
Helen, this is Rob Whittle. I just want to.
Hi.
Do you maybe want to explain to people a little bit more, as Thomas touched on, like sort of redundancy and a little bit more of those sort of statutory provisions, because those don't really exist for the US labour force?
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of redundancies, I mean, I think that's that is something to highlight, because obviously we have seen some redundancies and opportunities being used as well during this period. I mean, we have very strict rules over redundancies, particularly where you are making redundant or potentially making redundant over 20 employees. So we have what's called collective consultation. 20 employees would require 30 days consultation, sorry, and you would be consulting for 45 days for 100 plus employees in the UK. If you're making individual redundancies, you still have a process to follow in terms of consulting with those employees, but it wouldn't be collective. So yeah, there are all those rules around redundancies, and it's not just redundancies. I mean, I suppose as well during this period, we've seen changes in terms and conditions being made. I'll come on to talk about agile working and flexible working arrangements in the UK. But again, if you're making any changes to terms and conditions and it affects 20 plus, you're going to be consulting for 30 days to make those changes fairly. So the same provisions applying to changes of terms and conditions under TULRA, which are our regulations in respect of that. So yeah, if you don't have all of that in the US, then that's something that is very familiar and something that really does have to be adhered to. Otherwise, you end up paying quite considerable sums, which are called guaranteed payments, where that consultation has not been applied.
But Helen, is it not also true that you could use a vehicle of a compromise agreement to
Okay, yeah. So that's it. So yeah, compromise agreements that are now actually settlement agreements. There are situations where you can have what's called a without prejudice discussion, and that means that where you are going to carry out a process, perhaps to terminate somebody's employment, whether it's by redundancy or for redundancy or another reason, you can have an off-the-record discussion and offer them a settlement agreement to exit without a process. Obviously, I caveat that by saying, you know, every situation is different. You should take advice on those situations, but we do have that in the UK. And then what that settlement agreement does is the employer pays a certain sum or gives favourable provisions to the employee on their exit, and the employee waives their rights to bring claims under that agreement.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for those additional comments. I think our next question will address the intellectual property area. And we have Stuart and David Green will address that area. So how do you protect your company's brand, product, trademark, and IP in the UK? Very broad question, but
Okay, so thanks, Larry. The general principles and how you do that are, and the means of doing it are largely the same as they are in the US. So we have patents for inventions. I guess it's perhaps that for patents, the rules around that are slightly more restrictive in that it's not as easy to patent software in the UK as it is in the US, where it's a bit more common. We have copyrights to software and other creative works. The difference there is that copyright in the UK arises automatically. You don't need to register it; it just arises, and you just have a right that comes from that. There are trademarks which operate in a very similar way to the ones in the US. We have design rights, again, where I think the equivalent in the US would be design patents that protect visual aspects of a product. There are also rights to protect databases and the contents of those, and as is often the case, rather than using formal protection like that, sometimes companies, businesses will just look to keep things secret and confidential and protect them by means of a contract, non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements.
So I guess question, Stuart, will with Brexit going through, is that going to affect registrations of international marks? Because a lot of the US companies you can register.
Yeah, what it will mean is that whereas previously you could obtain a UK trademark, for instance, via obtaining an EU trademark, that won't happen automatically. If you want a trademark in the UK and in other countries in Europe, you'll have to do 2 applications. Although there is the worldwide trademark process under by WIPO, WIPO, that can ease that process. But the point now is that there are, if you already had an EU trademark, what's actually happened at the beginning of this year is that it's been split in 2. So you have an EU trademark that covers the countries that are still in the EU, and the UK trademark authorities have created a EU mark for you that's a separate UK trademark and is enforced in its own right. One thing that is relevant to patents is if you have a patent in the US, if you apply within 12 months of getting that patent for the equivalent protection in the UK, you can actually use that as a starting point for your application here without having to do a brand new application. You do only have a 12-month period within which to do that, but that can make the process easier if you decide that a patent is what you would like to use to protect your IP here. The other thing to stress is, there's a well-developed legal process and robust process for enforcing those rights. There are specialist tribunals that deal with those particular rights, etc., that are easier process to go through than going to a formal court, although potentially you could still be in a formal courtroom to deal with an intellectual property dispute. There are these tribunals that endeavour to deal with disputes in a slightly simpler and yes.
Okay, good. All right, so that's sort of the legal perspective. David, do you mind commenting on the business person's perspective on this question?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not born in England. I'm from San Francisco. My wife and I have a company in Birmingham, and it's a British company that we started in 2012 And it's interesting you're talking about IP right now, because we're going through it now to do some trademark search for the regions of the UK, the EU, and America and Canada. And we're finding out some interesting things about the process of doing that. And Stuart, you mentioned the global process, and the lawyer that we're working with actually is a friend of, or a colleague of someone that we know from the British American Business Council, which everyone should join, because that's where you meet people. And he is a Kiwi, and he's helping us find access to all of this. And he's told us that for the most part, you should concentrate on where you're going to do business. You can get a global one, but it'll take you forever, and it's a lot of money. And it's, if you think about it in terms of practicality, what you really want to do is make sure you're covered in the regions that you're thinking about in the future. And that might be the UK, knowing that you're going into the EU. So you want those two regions, and then you worry about something else a bit later. You got plenty on your plate anyway. Right. From the brand perspective, that's going to be the tricky one. It's not quite as consistent across the countries that IP and trademarks are. You really do have to think about the space that you're in America, and you're going to have to do a lot of research in the UK to see where you fit in the space of the mindset of the British consumer, because that's what you're really talking about when you're talking about brand. It's inside someone's head, and you won't know that until you start asking questions. And as they say in America, you got one mouth and two ears, so probably better shut up and do a lot of listening.
It's always good advice. Okay. Sorry, we have to kind of keep moving along. So thank you for those comments. So the next question is, what are the key features of enforcing your business rights and protecting your business in the UK? And David Mann from Aaron is going to respond to that question.
Thanks, Larry. Well, I suppose the key thing to know about the system in England and Wales, which is obviously a part of the UK, we don't have the same exact jurisdiction between the entirety of the UK. So Scotland is a separate jurisdiction in itself. The law is very similar, but it is a separate court jurisdiction. And so we are attorneys, solicitors in England and Wales. We're a very solid jurisdiction. It's a jurisdiction that we are remarkably proud of, in that it's a court system that you can rely on. You've got lots of rules and regulations about how business is done over here, and the court is there to enforce it, and it does so regularly, and that can give you real confidence when you're trading. It's an adversarial system. It's very similar in many ways to the United States. It's a very similar system, but there are some key differences that anybody would have to be aware of. And I think probably the most important one, or perhaps the most interesting one, is how costs are dealt with. As I understand it in the United States, you pay your own legal costs, and that's that. Whereas here in England and Wales, or in the UK, if you have a serious legal battle, particularly if it goes into the High Court, or even anything which isn't a small claim or in a tribunal, the rule is that the winner of the case has his costs or her costs paid for by the loser. And so when you enter into litigation, if you're litigating over a sum of money, let's say it's a sum of money of £100,000, say, it's not just £100,000 which is important. It's how much you're spending on the litigation, and how much as well that your opponent is spending on the litigation, because legal costs, as we all know, particularly when you're litigating large sums of money, can become quite significant. And then all of a sudden, there's actually three sums of money that you're interested in: your costs, the other side's costs, and indeed the sum that's being litigated over. The great thing about being able to shift costs is that it enables businesses to be flexible with the way that they fund litigation. And sometimes it just can't be avoided. I say to all clients, try not to run things to trial, try not to get into disputes, because quite often the only people who genuinely win from it are the lawyers. And you need to avoid, I'm not averse to that, of course, but it's really not great. You want to try and avoid being in disputes if you can. But if you do end up in that unfortunate situation here in the UK, because of the way costs are dealt with, it can be very flexible as to how it's funded. And we take great pride, particularly in our firm, that we essentially only really have two rules when it comes to costs in this regard. It's got to be a good deal for us, and it's got to be a good deal for you. And once it meets those two criteria, pretty much, if you can imagine it, we can do it in terms of funding. And it may even be the case that if you win, it will be the other side who pays the bill, which means that contingency fees, which I know are very popular in the US as well, they're of course available over here. There is no win, no fee agreements. You can insure, and I'm not quite sure of the situation in the US, but you can insure against adverse legal costs. Here in England and Wales, I often liken these what they call ATE policies. It's a bit like sort of your house is on fire. Once you've discovered it's on fire, you can then go out and get an insurance policy to cover the fact that it's on fire. That will pay out if your house burns all the way to the ground. There are some fabulous things that can be done to assist you with litigation. So that is probably one of the key differences, I think, and it's something which is definitely to be aware of. You don't actually have to face your opponent until trial here in England and Wales. You don't depose witnesses as you do in the US in advance of trial. You file witness statements instead, which are all written. So you don't actually have to go and see anybody, or you're not going to have questions asked of you, or you're not going to be able to ask questions of your opponent until you actually get to the trial. That's another specific difference. I know you guys have this process called discovery, which is what we called it until recently. We now call that process of showing your cards face up in terms of litigation. We now call it disclosure as opposed to discovery. I think ours is probably our system is probably a little bit more straightforward than yours. I know Larry has mentioned to me a couple of times that it's particularly difficult sometimes there in the US, or it can be. Ours is not hugely dissimilar. We've tried to do a lot of work on it as a jurisdiction over the last sort of 20, 30 years, trying to make it easier, trying to make justice more accessible along those particular lines. We've got lots and lots of different specialist tribunals as well. And so if you have an employment matter, say for instance, Helen might be dealing with you, you won't just come into the High Court where you will go everywhere else. You will go to a specialist employment tribunal where all they deal with is employment law. And that's great because the judges that you will go in front of, that's all they do. And so you're not going to be landed with a judge which has never encountered this area of law before. And of course, that only increases the risk of getting a rogue decision. And we have lots and lots of specialist tribunals for tax and for land, for employment. And so things that go into the High Court are more pretty much just about sort of shareholder disputes and contractual disputes. And that really does make the system quite attractive generally. Whichever system you're in, you don't want to litigate as far as I'm concerned. You don't want to get there. It's a problem. Who wants problems? Yeah, the best way to solve a problem is not to have it in the first place. Prevention is much better than cure. But from well, if you have to do it, this is a great jurisdiction. It's as good a jurisdiction as any. And it's one of the reasons why we are possibly one of the most popular jurisdictions to litigate in the world. Certainly the Asian markets tend to come to London or come to England and Wales in order to settle their disputes because of the incorruptibility of our judiciary. I know you guys have a very similar solid system there in the US. And so it's those similarities, I think, that make it particularly attractive. I hope I've covered things which are interesting there.
But the one other area that was interesting for commercial litigation anyway, generally there's not juries, where in the US you're entitled to request a jury.
Yeah, you just don't get that in England and Wales. The most people that will decide your case is 3 sitting on a panel of a tribunal. That's unusual. That tends to happen in tribunals such as the Employment Tribunal. If you're in the court, be it the County Court or the High Court, it will be 1 judge who just makes the decision. If it's a criminal matter, sort of, for murder or something along those lines, then yes, jury trials still exist.
It's kind of interesting you mentioned the international aspect, that a lot of times when we have to negotiate international agreements, we have to choose a location and entity for arbitration. So London obviously is one that comes up often.
It is. I mean, but of course, there are other places in England and Wales other than London. And we have the same law up here in the north of England as they do down in London. We have access to all the same resources. One crucial difference is it can often be a bit cheaper, but just as good.
Right. Good. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you, David.
Thank you.
For our next question, we're going to ask Ikram, sorry, a question regarding immigration, which I think this is of great interest to lots of U.S. businesses to try to understand how they're going to be able to try to manage immigration issues with employees. So, Ikram, if you don't mind answering, what should U.S. companies know about immigration in the UK?
Oh, absolutely. And I think as a starting point, I think one of the things I'll say, sadly, UK immigration a lot of the times is seen from a negative aspect, or is that's the way it's reported. But from a business perspective, there's been a lot of positive changes that have been introduced. So I think something that David and sort of Stuart said earlier, if you are looking to come and do business in the UK, it is actually a great time to be able to do it because of some of the recent changes that have come across, and I'll sort of highlight some of those positive changes shortly. But as a starting point, I think as a sort of a US national, being non-visa nationals, initially, if there were reasons to come and then sort of conduct business meetings in the UK prior to even setting up, there is a possibility of being able to come into the UK for a period of up to 180 days in a 12-month period, where that essential market research, the meetings, if they need to be sort of conducted with the right sort of people, businesses are able to do that without actually applying for any visas first. So that's a real positive, and in terms of and an advantage of being non-visa nationals, as of course there. And then the real consideration at the time, if you are thinking of course doing business in the UK, one of the key things in a visa that has been around for a number of years is that you are able to send a sort of a senior employee that you have in the US as to come over and set up the business entity in the UK. So there is a separate category to be able to do that. And the key advantage is of course having a senior employee overlook the key aspects of that business. Nobody's going to know your business better than that particular person. So that's a real advantage. And once you have sort of set up that presence in the UK, some of the changes that I highlighted, so the positive changes that have come about, that once you've got the business entity in the UK, you apply to the Home Office to sort of become an approved sponsor to be able to bring overseas workers. Now, these overseas workers may, of course, be existing employees that you have from the US that would come over in an intra-company transfer visa category, which I believe sort of exists in the US already. So where you have UK businesses that have set up in the US, you have the intra-company visa. That, of course, exists in terms of being able to bring employees to the UK. And of course, if those employees want the opportunity to be able to work here in a long-term sort of, the objective is long-term and even obtain settlement in the UK. The other category as a sponsor license that you can apply is as a skilled worker. And that allows, again, sort of businesses to recruit and employ sort of, employees from the US with that specialist and skilled knowledge, but also anywhere from across the world. And some of the positive changes, as I mentioned, that really came about, and I think are real positive for businesses at the moment, are sort of the reduction that we've seen in the skill level required to be able to come to the UK. So previously you had sort of a level where the role that they were coming to fulfill in the UK would be at a graduate level. There's been a considerable sort of reduction in that, allowing sort of the, I don't like to class them as a sort of the non-skilled workers, but I think certainly in terms of some lower skilled occupations where businesses still need employees to be able to come over and then perform that role because they know the business as well, they're able to do that. The key difference again has been the abolishment of what was known as previously the resident labour market test. And what that meant prior to 1st of December 2020 is that if you had a presence in the UK, what you really had to show to be able to employ somebody from overseas is that you were not able to find a suitable settled worker here in the UK. Now, that being abolished is really great for businesses because they are now able to bring in workers from all across the world, really. So not necessarily just the US. So even you are a US-based company, you can bring in workers that you feel are best for that particular role to be able to come and then work in the UK. So that's been a key part. A reduction in sort of the minimum salary that was required. So in terms of costs, whilst you're applying for a sponsor license and becoming a approved sponsor, you're of course, spending money in doing that. But in line with that, there's been a drop in sort of the minimum sort of salary that you need to pay to the workers. So of course, it doesn't go below the minimum wage in the UK. But again, a considerable sort of reduction has been there. So it's another positive. And I think one of the key aspects that's now come about is that there's been a suspension of the annual quota of what they allows overseas workers to come into the UK. So there was previously a limit that they had on annually, which was then distributed sort of in a monthly sort of a process, where you would then get those employees who were on the shortage of occupation list or were being paid a higher salary. They got the preference. With the suspension of that having come through, and I think there are talks that rather than a suspension, there may be a complete abolishment of that particular requirement. It again doesn't limit you to be able to bring the number of employees into the UK. So really overall, I think, in terms of that, some real positives for doing business in the UK and then expanding and then, entering the market really.
Okay, thanks. We're going to talk a little bit later about Brexit and the US-UK, but I think there's some participants on the call here that are particularly interested in immigration. So if any of you have questions on immigration issues or really any other questions, I haven't seen any questions come up in the chat yet. So please submit that. We seem to be running pretty well on time. So I think we might have some time at the end here to answer some questions. So please feel free to submit some questions. Okay, so again, trying to thank you for those comments, and we'll see if somebody else, if there's any questions come in to follow up on. So in the meantime, I'm going to ask Rob Whittle, who's again an accountant that works both in the UK and in the US, about what are tax implications of doing business in the UK, again, with your knowledge of how we Americans tend to look at tax issues. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, cheers, Larry. So what I'm going to try and do in the next few minutes is just do a compare and contrast, because I've often found if you're not familiar with another taxing jurisdiction's system, then it's easier to understand it if you've got something to base that knowledge on. So if you go to the UK, most probably the first tax that you could be subject to is VAT. That's likely to be the first one you could even have to pay, be subject to, even if you didn't have an actual physical presence in the UK. So the VAT stands for value added tax. It's the equivalent in the US of sales tax, but it's the equivalent but slightly different. And I'll just give you an example of how it's different in the US than the UK. So as Larry said, we're an accounting firm. So if I go out in the US and I buy a laptop to prepare tax returns on and memos, I'll pay $1,000 plus the sales tax. But even though I'm a business, because I'm the ultimate consumer of that piece of equipment, I have to pay the sales tax on it. So it maybe costs me $1,060. In the UK, as a business and being VAT registered, I would go out and buy that computer for £1,000 and pay 20% VAT on it, so it cost me £1,200. But because I'm VAT registered, I can actually claim that VAT back. So ultimately, it costs me £1,000. So normally, certainly in our industry, it's sort of certain things you're out there. It's that you'd pay sales tax on. You have to account for VAT, but you actually are able to claim it back. In a business-to-business situation, if VAT is done correctly, you recover VAT on expenses you've paid and you charge it on services you render. But at the end of the day, it's really cash flow, and it's just managing the cash flow. VAT shouldn't be a cost to you as a business in the UK if it's done correctly. The next tax you're most probably going to come across is obviously employee withholding tax, which in the UK we call PAYE, pay as you earn. Most probably a lot simpler than the US, because everybody knows in the US, especially in Ohio, you have to worry about federal tax, Ohio tax, local work city tax, federal unemployment tax, state unemployment insurance, all those sorts of things. In the UK, you've just got PAYE, so the equivalent of federal tax, and that will be calculated and worked out and withheld from your wages as you go along. And as an employer, you are required to pay that across to HMRC as you receive it. Most probably the bigger difference between the UK and the US, where maybe there's some opportunity for some planning, is when you get into social security taxes. So in the UK, employees pay 12% national insurance, which is equivalent of US Social Security on their sort of first 50,000 they earn. And then above that, it goes down to 2%. In the US, as everybody knows, it's 7.65% up to about 100, I think it's about 135,000 now, and then goes down to 1.45%. But the biggest difference is on the employer's side. In the US, you have the 7.65, which goes down to 1.45. In the UK, you pay 13.8% on all wages. So as you can see, it costs you as the employer in the UK a lot more to on a apples for apples basis in the US. The difference in the UK is obviously in the UK that's sort of 13.8, and this national insurance sort of covers your health insurance, or you get socialized medicine in the UK, where in the US you're always going to have to take out health insurance, so that's an additional cost. But also just be aware that if you send people over from the US to the UK and they're only in the UK for a short period of time, you can still keep them on the US Social Security system via a certificate of coverage, which is sometimes quite beneficial to US individuals coming to the UK for a short period of time to set up the operation. They still can pay into the US system, don't have to pay into the UK system for national insurance, and then in a sense can make sure they're fully funded for when they retire back in the US. Next, corporation tax. In the UK, we have one level of corporation tax, which is at 19% at the moment. And just like the US rate is marked to go up, the UK rate is marked to go up to 25% starting April the 1st of 2023. But the difference in the UK compared to the US is you don't have to worry about sort of local income taxes. So you haven't got a state income tax or a county income tax or a city income tax in the UK, which you could have in the US at a business level. It's just 19% at the moment. And the big difference between UK and US is if you're an owner managed business and starting up in the UK, that 19%, you don't actually have to pay that to the HMRC until 9 months and 1 day after your tax year, whereas everybody knows in the US, you have to pay your estimated taxes during the tax year. I thought it might just be interesting to just go through a few taxable benefits, a bit different from the EU. So in the UK, you can put a mileage claim in like you can in the US. I think the big difference is if you do provide health insurance in the UK to your employees, it's a taxable benefit. Whereas in the US, it's a tax deduction to the business and not a taxable benefit to the employees. I think as we mentioned before a little bit earlier with pensions and stuff like that, in the UK, there's sort of what we call auto-enrollment. So after a period of time, everybody has to, as a company, you have to set up a pension scheme in the UK and the employer has to contribute to it. Whereas in the US, there's more flexibility on that. I think one of the things we come across with a lot of our clients, because we only deal with owner managed businesses, is the thing of trying to repatriate profits back from the UK back to the US in an efficient manner. So as in the US, the UK has transfer pricing rules, and you're just trying to move monies back through the pricing of the goods or the services, management fees, amounts for intellectual property and such like things. And it's just making sure that when you do that, you've got it documented, and in effect is you're satisfying both the UK tax authorities and the US tax authorities with respect to those monies going backwards and forwards between the two companies. Talking about the repatriation, I think this gets very interesting because I think, as we mentioned earlier on, I think Stuart might have mentioned at the start, is there's certainly less forms of entities to do business in the UK than there is in the US. Most of the clients we work with would come to the UK and set up a corporation, which would maybe be owned by a US holding company or a US operating company. And in the owner managed business world, you'll get into, sometimes you'll have to think about from a US perspective, is whether you want to do a check the box selection to treat that UK company as a partnership potentially, or as a disregarded entity for your US tax planning purposes. So certainly, as everybody knows, in the US, a lot of the times people in the US will do businesses through an S corporation if they're an owner managed business, or through an LLC taxed as a partnership. You've just then got to, in a sense, work through with your accountant and your US accountant to work out how you want to have that UK entity tax to, in a sense, minimize your overall global effective tax rate. And that becomes challenging, and it becomes sometimes even more challenging if you've got US citizens that have companies in both countries and reside in the UK as well. And given the tax changes to the GILTI rules sort of 3-4 years ago, this has made the whole area a lot more complicated and a lot more challenging. And I think going forward, assuming that President Biden makes some of the changes in this area, I think it'll actually make it far more complicated for owner-managed businesses to be doing business between the two countries, or with respect to the US, business with any other country around the world because of those rules. So if you are looking to expand, that's certainly an area that I would suggest you speak to your US accountant about with respect to that, to make sure that you don't pay excess tax for the sake of it.
All right. Well, thank you, Rob. You actually, every question I had, you answered. So
that's good.
Presentation there. And again, there might be some follow-up questions people can put in chat if they had, I suppose, kind of practical experience with how to handle where we are as far as U.S. international taxes, kind of up in the air, moving from one program and then maybe to another program. So to keep moving along here, our next question is what resources and incentives are available for U.S. companies interested in opening or expanding business in the UK? So that'll be for, we'll go with Joe, break it up, and then go back to you, Rob.
Thank you. So in terms of incentives available, we at the Local Enterprise Partnership have a number of business grant and loan packages available. We also provide training support for businesses, both working with the university and with some of our FE colleges. And we've recently established a number of peer-to-peer networks as well to help people get to know the businesses on your doorstep and also in wider sectors as well. We work very closely with our local authorities to provide dedicated account management. So for businesses that were looking to invest in the area, we could also help with a kind of landing package in terms of identifying potential sites and locations. And that is also a partnership that includes national government as well, through the Department for International Trade. The other package we have is around a program that we refer to as enterprise zones. That's been specifically targeted at a science corridor across Cheshire and a number of key sites. Over recent years, that has allowed us to provide discounts in business rates for businesses located on those sites, which has been another incentive. That did come to an end at March this year. A number of businesses have taken advantage of that, and it's something that we're exploring extending with national government looking into future years. The other point I wanted to stress, and for colleagues to be aware of, picks up on something Rob said, which is the nature of local government and I guess state level government is very different in the UK to what you see in the US. So we don't have the same kind of local taxes in the way that you would see in the US, and we have a quite centralized system and then a lot of redistribution from national government. So one of the key elements that we can bring is that partnership with national government. But I think that operating environment with that different tiers of government would feel quite different in a UK context, and is something that we could help people navigate. And also, as David has touched on as well, we also have devolved government within Wales and Scotland, and there's a bit of kind of navigating how that fits with the UK government too. So it's worth colleagues just being aware that that system looks quite different here.
Right. So instead of county or state level sort of tax rebates or exemptions, it's really more of a grant system than.
Exactly. You don't have that same level of kind of ability to offer those tax rebates or incentives. It is more grant based or loan based. So yeah, it would feel quite different, I think, in that regard. If, for example, you're in conversations about different potential locations in the UK, it would feel different than perhaps you'd feel when you were looking across the different states in the US.
Cities and counties competing with each other, right?
Yeah, you'll have an element of that, but they won't have the same tax incentives to do that. So it will be more about the quality of the operating environment and perhaps some grant alongside it, as opposed to the competition you would see in the US.
There may be some benefits for that. Doing it that
I won't comment on that.
So, Rob, I can add some comments.
I think Joe covered most things. So I think I might just look at it one or two of not tax. I wouldn't say tax incentives, tax benefits. So in the UK, if you come to the UK, and we're talking, Joe, you're talking about the science belt. There is the UK has a research and development tax, not credit per se, compared to the US. But the difference between the UK and the US is in the US you get a research and development credit, which you can really only utilize if when you're making a profit. But in the UK, you can actually monetize your R&D tax relief and actually get money back from the government even before you are actually making money. So you can actually get money back from the government by sort of almost cashing in your future benefit at a lower rate. There is also just come out recently, because of, I think, with everything that's going on with COVID, to try and encourage people to invest in businesses, that you sort of get an enhanced business deduction. So I think it said if you spend 100,000 on equipment, or you get 125,000% deduction. So there's things like that going along. And the other thing I think some of the companies will use is this sort of apprenticeship scheme. So if you are able to employ apprentices and meet the certain requirements, the government will sort of give you up to £3,000 back towards their costs for the year. So those are just a few of the other ones, which are sort of more tax based.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for those comments. So then our next question, and you'll have about 3 minutes to tell us the answer to this. Good luck. So how do you expect Brexit, US-UK trade agreements to impact business in the UK? And I guess, you know, some Americans were always wondering, well, are the parties negotiating, and is there sort of any kind of expectation on when something might be completed? So,
yeah, well, I guess the obvious point is it's early days for Brexit, and how it's going to impact UK in terms of its dealings with the EU. It's you know, there are lots of things being discussed at the moment in terms of finalising some of the detail of the trade deal going forward. I think it's fair to say that the trade deal that was sort of took effect at the beginning of this year is only a light version of a full trade agreement. Only covers certain types of trade. In particular, it focuses on goods, whereas the UK economy is principally based on services. And there's a lot to come out of the watch in terms of the whole process of import between the UK and the EU. But having said that, our experiences for our clients who are already exporting to other parts of the world or importing from other parts of the world, they've all kind of already had the processes in place to deal with the new requirements that they're now impacted upon when they're dealing with the EU. So I think people will find a way to deal with it. So I don't think in itself it's a reason to put off investing in business in the UK. In terms of a US-UK trade agreement, I hinted at this earlier. As far as I know, there are no active discussions. We obviously, you have a new president in the US who clearly has different priorities to the previous president. And I suspect that the UK-US trade deal is not as close to the top of his list of things to do that it was for Donald Trump. So we'll have to wait and see. But clearly, there's a long-standing tradition of investment by the US in the UK. So I don't see any reason why that won't continue. And maybe a trade agreement will make that easier. But what it will actually mean in practice, I think we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Ikram?
Yeah, I think as Stuart said, it's sort of still very early days to sort of see the real impact. But I think from the immigration aspects of things, I think the rule changes that I sort of mentioned, you automatically saw a positive change for businesses sort of come in for those opportunities. And then just as a sort of a statistic, sort of a figure for UK businesses themselves, or what we don't actually have a figure of, but a lot of sort of European businesses that have contacted us about, again, setting up the businesses in the UK. And there's been a sort of a large increase in terms of the approved sponsors that I was sort of mentioning earlier, with businesses becoming approved sponsors. So prior to sort of Brexit and things being in place, the overall number of businesses that became approved sponsors were in the region of just over 23,000. Now within the sort of you've had the 4 or 5 months period where we're at the moment, we've seen an increase to go above 34,450. So that's the statistic that I've just seen today. So that's already, in terms of a 11,000 increase. And when you look at the numbers, it's certainly showing that although there may have been some reluctance for businesses at the start, I think there are positives now, and I think businesses are sort of taking that positive step to sort of move forward. So yeah, encouraging signs.
All right,
Of
good.
course,
So it sounds like,
we'll see with time.
sounds like everyone will carry on until they get to whatever they're doing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have a question now for the business folks, just to get some practical information. So Thomas and David, if you could please share your perspective on cross-cultural facets of conducting business in the UK.
Thomas, do you want me to go first or you want to go?
David, feel free. I will fill in as much as I can.
Okay.
The battle of the hair going on here, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about, I kind of did it a bit backwards because we started a business in the UK.
Good speak, right?
And we expanded into the US on the East Coast in 2015. And my wife and I are from California. So the East Coast to us is like another country. And it was, for us, it was a new adventure to find out, you know, the culture in Charleston, South Carolina, and Atlanta, and a little bit in New York. So it was, I can tell you that it's much easier to start a business in the UK than it is in the US, because in the UK, there's only one state, and that's the UK. And there's not 50 different places you have to go to register yourself and register your company. It's as Rob said about taxes, it seems it's just a little bit easier to do in terms of things like payroll and taxes generally in the UK. And it doesn't matter where in the UK you're working from. There's no, you know, paid family leave taxes or anything like that you have to worry about. It's all one central fund that the federal government takes care of. And then as far as the regions are different. You know, it's a country the size of California in terms of its space, but there's this phenomena. It's called the M25, and people inside the M25, otherwise known as London, can't seem to get out of it. It's like Trump's wall. And the rest of us, I always tell people from America, after being here for 17 years, if you really want to meet some English people, you got to get outside of London and go meet somebody in some other, you know, town or city outside of London. And the population's shift, it seems to be the growth is moving that way too. Not just on, you know, from the pandemic, because I think people are moving out to what they call the home counties, which are the counties outside of London. But they're moving to places like, I know they're moving to Birmingham because in the past 3 or 4 years, there's been a phenomenal shift in building. There are so many apartment buildings now being built, and they're being occupied as well. They're not building these things just to have them and cross their fingers and hope somebody moves into them. So I know people are moving in here, and I'm sure that's true of the North as well. And I think that's where the growth opportunities are for anybody who wants to invest in the country. And it's probably a wise move to think about that first before you start thinking about London. And I don't mean to disparage London, because it's a great place. I lived and worked there for 3 or 4 years, but it is an expensive city, and it's just as interesting outside of London as it is in. So that's my perspective in terms of the actual regions inside the UK.
Okay, thanks. We got to kind of jump over to Thomas.
Yeah, just quick. I know we might be a little bit pressed for time, but I agree with that. UK is not just London. London is a little island, and I would also agree, go outside of London. That's where you will see the real UK, and there's definitely subtle differences both in dialect and languages throughout UK. Just something to be aware of as well. And then from my own perspective, I just think that business in general, at least the business I operate in, we're more formal in the UK than it is in US, both from a dress code point of view and just the way that you conduct business. But it's very professional, but slightly more formal than what we're used to over here.
Okay. And then maybe as a follow-up to that, Thomas, these kind of blend together. The next question, human side of working in the UK, what's it like to live and work in the UK?
Yeah, but I can from a very personal point of view, I really enjoyed it. I had almost 4 years in the UK, had an office in Manchester and an office in Dublin. Really enjoyed having that whole culture side of it. It's a beautiful countryside of UK is just fantastic, spectacular, great place to live, great place to have a family. And so from that point of view, it was really, really enjoyable. And I think the business climate, as we talked about earlier on, as many people have mentioned through this call, it's a great business climate. It's a professional business climate. It's relatively easy to set up businesses. And so yeah, slightly enjoyable. And what I said before, if people are considering setting up in UK, as I said, just do it. It's of course easier said than done. But what I mean with that is really that it's a great business environment. It's a great economy. It's a big economy within Europe, and it's a good place for an American company. Of course, from a language point of view, it's easier to set up there than probably any other places in Europe. Yeah, I have only good things to say, and thoroughly myself enjoyed to live and work in the UK.
Very good. And then Helen, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think briefly from an employment perspective, I think it's important to say, you know, there's employment legislation that protects very much the employer and the employee. So, we've covered some of that today, but I would emphasise that. I'd also say that, you know, through the sort of COVID period, I'm sure not dissimilar to the US, we've seen lots of changes to the ways that we work. You know, lots of flexible working requests, agile working. Just as an example, I act for a big housing trust, thousands of employees. They had huge premises, which they are now selling. All of their staff are going to be working from home for the future. That was a fairly big project because, as we discussed before, you have to collectively consult where you're making changes to T's and C's. So even if the employees were embracing that and saying how lovely, you know, to be working from home now, that wasn't what their contract said. So collective consultation, but yes, I think we've got happy employees working far more flexibly now. Inevitably, as a result of COVID, we've got a different way of working moving forwards, but I would say a lot of flexibility, a lot of home working, agile working, and as I've said, you know, a lot of legislation to protect both the employer and the employee in the UK. So yeah, I would say a great place to work and very good time to be coming over here and to be doing business in the UK.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think what we'll do, we had one more question, but I think we've kind of discussed that area already. So I think what I'd like to do is, if we have any questions for the panel, if anybody wants to ask a question. I guess in the meantime, Thomas, during our prep session, it was kind of an interesting comment you made about sort of and somebody mentioned it earlier. I mean, the idea of a U.S. company opening a business in England is to make money and to be able to send it back. But you know, I think you had indicated that in your experience that an important area is that if you're going to make a decision to conduct business in UK or any country, really, is to have, or vice versa, if you're in England, you want to come into the US, it's going to take, you have to have a plan that you're going to have to invest in it, and it's going to take some time. Is perhaps something where people aren't successful is sort of the time it takes to ramp up. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so we had an earlier comment there. So what I elaborated on was that we of course all open our businesses or daughter companies with the intent of make a profit. Otherwise, we probably shouldn't do it unless we are non-profit, of course. But with that being said, then as soon as we do that, and we do that outside of the US, for example, in the UK, you also expose yourself to currency and the fluctuation of that. And there's taxes and other implications of the money that you make. And it's of course a positive problem to a certain extent to have, but on the other hand, there might also be other vehicles to look at that. So if you are already expanding your business, you might want to take that overseas funds and look at how can I expand that further, for example, into Europe. You might also look at that as a good vehicle in regards to M&A activities to acquire product lines, businesses, and other things, and in generally grow that business. So don't necessarily just think it as money that you need to claw back and take back to the US as an example, but take it as investment funds that you can utilize for acquisitions to grow your business or grow outside of the UK, for example, into Europe as well.
Good. And then, and again, obviously you have to coordinate that with your international tax.
Of course.
To coordinate.
Larry, sorry, there was one question on IP that came up. If you and Stuart would mind handling it. The question was, we currently have a community trademark registration. With Brexit, will we need to file a separate trademark registration for the UK at some point?
Well, I can answer that. What should have happened is that the UK trademark registry should have basically created a mirror trademark for you in respect of the UK part of your community trademark. So essentially what you should have now is 2 trademarks, one for the UK and one for the remaining countries in the EU. I mean, if that hasn't happened, you haven't had any correspondence from the UK trademark registry or whoever acted for you when you got your community trademark, that's something we can obviously help with and look up for. That's what's meant to have happened.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess if we have a little bit of time here without questions, I guess, again, circling back to the business people who drive these projects and keep the lawyers and accountants busy. So I guess, David, if you have any kind of additional, just general experiences that you'd like to share. And then
Yeah,
we go to Thomas.
Yeah, I would just say, really, it's network as much as you can, because you're not going to know everything, and I still don't know everything. And I've been working with Rob for like the last 5 or 6 years, so there's just so much that changes every year, and so many different laws that change. On immigration, it changes. From the U.S. to the UK, and either way. So join organizations, get to know people. They always know other people. The more you start talking to people, the easier it will be. So do as much networking as you can.
Okay. And then Thomas?
Yeah, along the same line, network, utilize the various trade networks and commerce that you might have in there. And then, of course, work with Wegman and work with Aaron&Partners and companies alike. It's extremely important to have the right partners when setting up businesses and getting the right information, and make sure that the structure is correct. That'll make life easier in the long run.
Very good, very good. Okay, well, with the goal of wrapping up by our end time, just go over again the rich history of trade between the US and the UK, a lot in common. Doing business in the UK is accessible and practical. And if you want to grow in the UK, think about the Northern Powerhouse to reach out to some of the folks there who can assist both with the practical logistics of setting up the business, and then perhaps some, I guess, grants, not as opposed to rebates and tax exemptions. And I think, as in Cleveland, there's excellent advisors and expertise available. And I think also in that line, just as we're here in Cleveland, Ohio, the cost of living is much less, and much more cordial ability to conduct business. Similar experience can be had in north of England, as a few folks have mentioned here. What I'd like at this time to really thank for everyone for joining and sticking. Most of us stuck through the whole hour and a half, so I appreciate everybody joining. If there are questions for any of us afterwards, please feel free to send an email to either me or to Scott, and then we can loop in the right people if you have any questions that we can help with. Again, want to thank all the panelists for preparing, and I'd especially like to thank 2 people who don't have their names or pictures up here. There's Judy Bodenhamer, who had to come over here because our office internet failed, so we had to go on the fly here. And Helen Johnson is at Aaron's, and so both Judy and Helen we've been doing this for, I think, about 4 months now. So we really appreciate them handling all the coordinating of speakers and the logistical issues you have to work through to do this sort of presentation. So unless there's any other, Stuart, do you have any other comments?
No, I think we've covered everything. And yes, thanks again to everyone who's helped organise this event and all the members of our panel today.
Very good. Well, we certainly hope to stay in touch with all of you, and hopefully with the weather warming up, we can all get outside and maybe get back to somewhat normal life again. So again, appreciate everybody joining, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you all.
Thank you.